So we had a real monetary system up until the late 1970s. It wasn't as good as it was earlier in its history, but at least there was some real backing. At least we had real money behind the Federal Reserve notes. They weren't IOU nothings. They were actually legitimate notes. Look what's happened ever since we completely abandoned the gold standard and have gone to a complete fiat-based system where the Federal Reserve just creates as much money as it wants. We've had nothing but inflation, and we've had asset bubble after asset bubble, and the last one has finally exploded, and it was so huge, the real estate bubble was so enormous that there's no way to blow up another one. In fact, when President Obama now is talking about an economic stimulus, right? He wants to stimulate the economy, and he wants the Federal Reserve to do it, right? Well, why are we in such a mess, right? Well, George Bush did exactly what Obama is doing now. It was the same policy. He inherited a recession. He inherited the bursting of the stock market bubble, which of course inflated because of Federal Reserve activity, just like the housing bubble. And when the bubble burst, what did George Bush want? He wanted a stimulus. He wanted the Federal Reserve to do something about that bubble. He wanted the Federal Reserve to fight off that recession by increasing money supply, printing more money, creating additional inflation. And so because of the Alan Greenspan, George Bush economic stimulus of 2001, 2002, we're in the trouble that we're in today. Because the stimulus was blowing up a real estate bubble. The stimulus was encouraging Americans to buy cars they couldn't afford, to buy houses they couldn't afford, to buy all sorts of consumer goods imported from the rest of the world that they couldn't afford. And we ran this phony economy where everybody spent money they didn't have. And now the bills are coming due, and we're surprised that we're in this mess. And what does Barack Obama want to do? He wants to do exactly what George Bush did. He wants Ben Bernanke to do what Alan Greenspan did. The problem is every time you do this, it's like a junkie. Every time you come down, you need a bigger and bigger fix to get high again. And the problem is there is no fix big enough at this point. They've already got interest rates down to 0. And, you know, Alan Greenspan, at least he stopped at 1%. Now they're 0. And look at what the Fed is buying. I mean, initially the Fed had to have gold behind our money. What's behind it now? Subprime mortgages, credit card debt, auto debt, toxic loans that, you know, were polluting the balance sheets of all these banks, and now the Fed owns them. And where do they get the money? They just print it up. And, you know, President Obama likes to pretend that, oh, he's not raising taxes on the middle class. He's only raising taxes on the rich. He's raising taxes on everybody who has a job, anybody who has a savings account, because what he's doing is debasing our money. All this new money, all this new government isn't coming for free. There's a cost. And the cost is going to be paid for with the debasement of the value of our money and rising prices. Everybody is going to suffer because the government is getting bigger. It's not just the people that are paying the taxes, because the inflation tax is the real tax that everybody's paying. And if it wasn't for the Federal Reserve, it would be impossible to impose that tax. If we had real money, if we had constitutional money, the government they couldn't spend money unless they raised it in taxes, or they'd have to actually get real gold. They couldn't just print it. And we couldn't even have a government this enormous if there was some discipline, if there was some monetary discipline. We couldn't have a $3 trillion budget in a year. I think it's actually 3.6 trillion is what the government's going to spend. They couldn't spend that if they had to spend real money. You know, so what we need to do is we need to reinstall some discipline on the government, because they have no discipline now. They have no monetary discipline. And if you look at the abuse of power, if you look at what these people think that they can get away with, if you look at what Ben Bernanke and Paulson have done, and if the courts look at that and they say, you know, it's okay, we don't see anything wrong with that. If they don't hand down an indictment of these officials, then what kind of message does that send to politicians? And again, it's always, you know, the camel's nose under the tent. And unfortunately, what the government is doing now, right? this massive increase in the size of government is the precise opposite of what they should be doing. Because right now, the government is in the process of creating another Great Depression. And unfortunately, it's probably going to be worse than the depression that they created in the 1930s because of the tools that we have now. We weren't on this fiat-based system, so the Federal Reserve wasn't able to do as much damage in the 1930s as it's going to do today. And there's no respect whatsoever for the Constitution. I mean, back in the 1930s, at least a good portion of the New Deal was thrown out as unconstitutional. And even what wasn't thrown out was unconstitutional, but Roosevelt packed the courts. But now, you don't have to pack the courts. The government does anything it wants. Nothing is unconstitutional. You know, I was on CNN the other day, and, you know, I tried to point out that the TARP was unconstitutional because I said there's nothing in the Constitution that says the government can bail companies out. And one of the people on there objects and says, oh, of course it's constitutional. It's because of the Commerce Clause. I mean, how can it? The Commerce Clause of the Constitution says that Congress has the right to regulate commerce. That's all it says. It can regulate commerce. How can anybody get from that they can bail out companies that are failing? Regulating commerce means the commerce, not the companies that are engaged in the commerce itself. And even if you can regulate companies engaged in commerce, even if you accept that misinterpretation of the Constitution, regulate does not mean bail out. Regulate does not mean give them taxpayer money so they can stay in business. So there's no respect for the Constitution whatsoever. So any cockamamie scheme that Congress comes up with, they'll just enact it. There's going to be no restraint on what the government does. And the reason that the recession or the depression was so bad in the 1930s was because the government refused to let the market work. The government subsidized and legislated and bailed out and did everything they could in the name of easing the pain, trying to stimulate the economy. They used different words, but it was the same thing. And we created a depression. And the problem is now our country going into this depression is in far worse shape financially. We're not the industrial power that we were in 1930. We don't have the savings and the manufacturing, and we have massive debt. And we had a tiny government. When Roosevelt came in and expanded the size of government, it was basically non-existent. And even though he doubled the size, it was still tiny. You know, it was a fraction of a GDP. And so as much damage as Roosevelt did, we were wealthy enough to afford it. We eventually got out of the Depression despite the New Deal. We would have got out a lot sooner, but at least the economy was strong enough to withstand all the damage the government was doing. We're not in that situation today. And unfortunately, the people who are in charge, you know, are so clueless. They actually think they understand why we had a depression, but they're 100% wrong. They think we had a depression because the Fed didn't print enough money. And if they just would have printed more money, everything would have been okay. No. It's going to be worse. See, the problem is not that the bubble burst. That's not the problem. That's the solution. The problem is that the Fed blew it up in the first place. And now we have to deal with the consequences. But only the market can deal with the consequences. We need to restore a balanced, viable economy. We can't live in a bubble, which means people need to be productive in this country. People need to save their money, and people need to produce stuff. We can't just keep borrowing money and buying stuff and pretending we have a real economy. But in order to get back to that sound economy, the phony one is going to have to collapse, and we can't keep trying to prop it back up in the name of short-term stimulus. We have to let it fail. A lot of people have to lose their jobs. That's just how it's going to have to be because the jobs are inefficient. We can't artificially support them. We don't want jobs because we want work. We want the stuff that the jobs produce. We want the productivity. And there are a lot of companies that are going to have to fail. I mean, there's a lot of companies that aren't profitable. They can't stay in business. There is nothing wrong with a company going bankrupt. What's wrong is keeping an insolvent company in business to squander even more resources. Right? If a company is losing money, right, that means it's taking resources that are scarce, it's taking labor, it's taking capital, and it's combining them in a way where it's destroying value. We want to stop that as soon as possible. We don't want it to drag on. We don't want to lose even more money. But that's what the government wants to do. The government wants to keep these businesses in place. You know, I was on CNN last night talking about the bailouts for the automobile companies. And when I said, look, the government needs to let them fail, you know, Ali Belshi is on there saying, but Peter, what about all the people who are going to lose their jobs? We can't let these people lose their jobs. You know? Well, exactly. But what they don't understand is, what about all the jobs that we destroy to keep these companies in business? Nobody sees those jobs.